course, thanks, Fatima, for that introduction, and thanks for putting this all together along with your excellent team. But for the, for those online on attending this, if you just use the chat box just to give us a sense of your background and your name and where you are in terms of location, that just gives us a sense of how to direct the conversation as we start. But thank you, Fatima, for inviting us. My name is Dr. Wifa. I'm a senior energy law lecturer at the University of Aberdeen School of Law. I'm also the convener of the Global South Law Research Network, and I'm joined by two fantastic postgraduate researchers as well. And I'll let them introduce themselves before I get back to speaking. I'll pass over to Tayo and then, or Belema and then Tayo, just in that order.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Belema Ibim. I'm a doctoral researcher at the School of Law, University of Aberdeen. It's lovely to have everyone here today.
Fantastic. And over to you, Tayo.
Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Tayo Ibim, and I'm a postgraduate researcher as well at the University of Aberdeen, where I am investigating environmental governance and participatory governance in energy licensing, essentially. I look forward to all the questions and responses to our presentation today. Thank you.
Fantastic. So thank you. I see Martina, and she's a journalist and an environmental enthusiast, which I think is fantastic, because some of the conversations would have interconnections with energy, environmental, and of course climate change is at the center of that. So we sure I'm hoping we can have a really engaging time. The topic is very carefully selected, and that's because the continent of Africa is at a crossroads. And what we'll do is use the theory of the energy quadrilemma to just underpin some of the, the issues that we would raise. But more particularly, we're looking at the role of law in balancing the nexus between energy and climate. And because these are the twin pillars, two main issues that really concern not just the continent of Africa, but the world globally. But it does appear that unfortunately the world moves on, and Africa seems to be left behind or lagging behind, despite having the best of intentions. And we just hope we can engage with that a little more.
Thank you for that. You actually, our first guest speaker is going to start with the presentation, Dr. Wifa, so you can continue without further delay.
Not a problem at all. So indeed, we are at a crossroads fundamentally, and what we are trying to do is, on one hand, maximize energy resources, but at the same time do it in such a way that it's not impacting the climate. In a very simple world, we would have sat down, not bothering whether we had power, whether we had energy. We would have, gotten food from our farms and lived very simply. But as a result of the revolution, there were thoughts to develop, and the world moved on and developed quite enthusiastically. And that is where resources like coal and whale oil, in fact, in the very early days, picked up in order to provide us with the energy resources that we need. And a lot of African countries are particularly rich in oil and gas, and that has contributed significantly in that development, particularly for Western countries. But unfortunately, despite owning the oil, one of the questions we've raised is that, or one of the theories that have been observed is that oil-rich nations are, or resource-rich nations, and this applies to both oil, but also critical minerals that are used for the energy transition. But we do see that resource-rich nations are underperforming in terms of development when compared to non-oil or non-resource-rich nations. Once you put that side by side with the level of environmental decay caused as a result of oil and gas extraction, it raises fundamental question. If you put that together with the significant energy poverty, and if you drill further, you would see that there is also fuel poverty. It raises a lot of concern that in the continent and in parts of Africa and in major countries, energy remains a heavy concern. And then you see that we are experiencing energy poverty, environmental degradation, and that has led to conversations around the resource curse. And so many have asked, are these resources a blessing or a curse? And the picture here just depicts, the complexity of the conversation. And so while the world grapples with climate change at a global scale, and parts of the Sahel and sub-Saharan Africa deal with drought and all of those things, and Belema will speak about that in more detail, we are fundamentally on the ground dealing with existential threats to our marine environment, and even our coastal environment where these oil resources are being maximized. And that raises fundamental questions: that have we got it wrong? Have we got the resources and not doing anything with it? But also fundamentally, is that resource becoming a curse or a blessing? And so we really just try to see where is that balance. How can that balance be struck? And that's because fundamentally the conversation starts with trying to achieve energy security. And it wouldn't matter where the energy is coming from, right? It wouldn't matter whether it's coal, if you're in South Africa, whether it's coal, if you're in Nigeria, whether it's oil or gas, and it doesn't really matter. Most countries want energy security. They want it to be available for them if they don't own it. So they would want to be able to access it and buy it. But at the same time, if they own it, they want to have some element of control. But the conversation is not as simple as that, because on one hand, you're dealing with energy security, but on the other hand, there is the question of energy equity, which is how accessible, how equitable is that energy distributed? So between those who have and those who don't. And that leads you to the dilemma. So that leads you to what we call the energy dilemma. So you're balancing energy security and energy accessibility in that sense. It's a very difficult balance to be struck, and a lot of countries and jurisdictions have struggled. If you look at the relationships between the Russia-Ukraine war, or the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, you will see the dynamics that created in Europe and parts of Europe fundamentally. Sorry. You would see the conversations or the complexity that's created in those relationships. So to some extent, as much as people would, question and sanction Russia, a lot of the European countries still rely on Russia for those resources. So it's a question of how is that these resources, as much as we want energy security, how equitably is it distributed? And fundamentally, that raises questions on sustainability. So oil and gas does sit fairly well within that framing. Does sit very well within those framings of energy security and energy equity. But the third element of it is it fundamentally, is it sustainable? Okay, and that is where the trilemma comes in. So you're balancing energy security, energy equity in that sense, but also environmental sustainability. Once you put oil and gas, which is what majority of our countries have, particularly for those of us who come from Nigeria, Ghana, and emerging economies that are discovering oil are asking these same questions as well. So, Mozambique, Tanzania, Guyana, the list goes on. Even Namibia very recently is really excited about the oil discovery. Once you put oil and gas within that framing, you begin to realize that it doesn't quite balance the trilemma, which is energy security, equity, and sustainability. And that is what leads many to say, where do we go from here? And we can ask a lot of questions. There's a whole lot of conversations or workshops and courses and trainings we can do more extendedly about these things in balancing the trilemma. But we're asking the question, if oil and gas doesn't sit quite well within that framing, particularly for countries who have them, where do we go from there? But I like to make a very clear distinction that within that context of the energy transition and what it means for the continent of Africa, or particularly African countries or countries in the global south that are reaching oil resources, I think a distinction needs to be made that very clearly the Western and developed countries, particularly the OECD countries that have maximized these resources to the detriment of others, but have developed, need to do, they need to do a lot more to reduce that use, reduce the carbon emissions, and also transition to cleaner energy sources. But again, there are two other elements that needs to be taken into consideration. So there are countries, for example, like Mozambique and Tanzania and Guyana, that are only just discovering oil and are saying, hey, wait a minute, guys, we need to catch up. It is unreasonable and unfair and unjust within the framing of a just transition to tell such emerging countries that they cannot maximize the oil resources if they've got it. But there's a third element to it, where countries like Nigeria, for example, that have had oil for decades, will not be able to make the same excuses that a country like Mozambique and Tanzania, that are only just emerging, would make, because it then means that fundamentally the question is not necessarily the energy source, but the framing and the governance and the management of those resources, to the extent that they have maximized oil resources for 60, 70 years and more, and there's been nothing to show for it. In such a circumstance, the transition to cleaner energy sources becomes so important for such a country, because again, if we dig deeper, we begin to see that the oil has created a false sense of complacency that has hindered growth significantly. So again, we can go on and on this and drill even further. But you then look at the social dimensions, that it begins to appear that we might be changing the energy source, but fundamentally the problem still reappears every now and again. And that's where sort of the social dimension sort of plugs in, that if we do balance the energy security and energy equity, the dilemma, and we somehow fundamentally manage to balance energy security, energy equity, and sustainability through the transition to renewable energy sources, the fourth question is, are we taking into account social dimensions, which we see in terms of oppositions to clean energy growth? And we've seen it in the NIMBY's theory of not in my backyard and all of those things, that there is a fourth element, that even within the context of the transition, we're still having to deal with things like energy colonialism and land grabbing and all of these issues that raise concerns within the context of the transition itself. And farmers are questioning how their lands are being used for the transition. And so we are changing the energy resource, but the downsides of that shift remains practically a practical reality. And that is where dimensions and some of the innovative approaches that we'll be engaged in, and Taya will speak more about later on, and tries in some ways to balance these four-pronged theoretical framings of the energy security, energy equity, sustainability, and social acceptance. So it is a complex balance, but I think it's one that can relatively fundamentally be achieved. And it can be achieved, and Africa does recognize that is possible in the Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. And it's a document that futuristically sees how we can maximize these energy resources. Unfortunately, it lays emphasis on resources like wave and tidal, which I think misses the point, rather than maximize energy resources like wind. And that's because wave and tidal, even for Western countries, is very expensive. It's not as developed and advanced as it should. And that, to that extent, I question the framing in terms of that energy shift within the Agenda 2063 Africa we want. And I think that that should be looked into a bit further. But I'll kind of stop there, having framed this a little more, and pass on to Belema, who would then give us the realities of where climate change stands, and perhaps explore the role of law in navigating such a complex challenge. So over to you, Belema.
Thank you, Dr. Wifa. Okay, on this next segment, we'll be discussing more on climate change, energy transition, and the role of law. And at this point, it's important to clarify what climate change is, the energy transition, and why it's relevant to this particular discussion. Now, climate change is, usually a concept used to describe the significant and lasting change in the Earth's climate. It's usually described as a temperature increase due to human activities, such as the burning of fossil fuels, deforestation, and other industrial practices. And a lot of times we can see what is considered the impact of climate change with rising temperatures, as we've mentioned, rising sea levels as well, changing climate, and things that often result in destruction of not just livelihoods of people, but also result in health impacts and other impacts to not just human beings, but also to non-human entities. Now, it's important because the discussion has been mostly focused on climate change impacts on just human beings, but there's also another dimension to it where research has recently focused more on, which is the rights of non-human entities. Now, climate change, first of all, for human beings, we have different sort of vulnerabilities to classify how climate change affects people. And in some instances, you could see that climate change may have more devastating impacts on children, on youths, or even on women or people with disabilities. Now, some of these impacts can be presented in what I would classify as 3 dimensions, which is the health impacts, the social impacts, and the economic impacts. And from the health impact, you could see it with oftentimes fetal mortality rates, where pregnant women may be malnourished due to some sort of food scarcity caused by droughts, or even flooding that may have destroyed, agriculture that possibly people in marginalized communities rely on. And because those people may be classified as possibly low-income communities, they may not have other means, to sustain themselves. And oftentimes you would see a lot of children being malnourished, or a lot of pregnant women suffering from fetal mortality as well. And then in the social impacts, we talk about issues like migration, because oftentimes flood may destroy a particular community, and then that community is forced to migrate from one particular place to the other. And oftentimes the people the people in the more marginalized communities or in the more rural communities are not able to find some other means, of livelihood, and some of them may not be able to sustain themselves any further. And then with that also results in loss of livelihood, because the people who may have relied on agriculture, farming, and the rest of that for as a source of income, even those who may even rely on things like fishing as well, because of possibly loss of biodiversity or disruption of their ecosystem as well, it will also affect not just these species, but also human beings, in that there may be scarcity of food and loss of livelihood, as we've mentioned, and then of course other impacts which not just affect, as we said, human beings, but also affect other habitats. Now, when we go back to energy transition now, we have to discuss the relevance of how the law has come in to sort of curb the impacts of climate change. Now, usually there are 2 approaches that the global community has come to in addressing climate change, and they're usually expressed with either adaptation measures or mitigation measures. Now, when we refer to adaptation measures, we talk about how do we adapt to the impacts of climate change. These things are real and they are happening. We can see it. It's no longer just a concept that people talk about, but it's something that most people can see around them. And now, so how are we able to protect ourselves? How are we able to sustain ourselves? Do we just let it continue happening? Do we just let it continue destroying the community and so on? So what else can we do to sort of brace the impacts of this climate change? And that's what adaptation measures deals with. Now, for mitigation, it has to do with how do we minimize, these greenhouse gases and these fossil fuels. How do we minimize the use of these things that are, causing this global temperature increase? And what sort of measures, through an expression of the legal framework and regulatory framework, what sort of measures are we able to tackle using, these 2 classifications that we've mentioned here? Now, when we talk about the energy transition, we're talking about shifting from one form of energy to another. That's transitioning from the fossil fuel use into the cleaner sources of energy. But as Dr. Wifa mentioned, usually for African countries, especially for a country like Nigeria that relies so heavily on, these fossil fuels, it's a bit difficult to say that you completely shut down on fossil fuels and completely move to cleaner sources of energy. And it's not very realistic to say that in this way, as we are shutting it down, because as Dr. Wifa has mentioned to us too, we talk about issues of energy equity, and we talk about energy justice as well. And when we say that, we mean that in that way, if we are shifting from one form of energy to the other, are we also ensuring in that way that that form of energy is accessible to everybody, not just a particular class of people? These are some of the considerations in, for energy transition and how energy transition relates to the energy quadrilemma. So it's about balancing. Yes, we have a need to transition to cleaner forms of energy, but then how then do we go about it? We have to be reasonable, we have to be practicable. We know that we cannot entirely shut down on something that we rely majorly, as an economy for most of these developing countries, especially those that are heavily reliant on these fossils. So we look at these sources of energy that we're trying to shift into. Are they affordable for the general population? Are they accessible in that way? Is it something that can be readily available? These are some of the considerations when we are trying to balance moving away from these sources of energy, and then balancing this between the energy quadrilemma, as Dr. Wifa has discussed with us. And then we look more practically into how then, or what then can the law do about this? What more can the law do? And then we talk about, establishing coherent legal frameworks and regulatory frameworks to manage activities of these industries and so on. Now we have an international framework that is from the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, we also have the Paris Agreement as well. The Paris Agreement has been ratified by almost all countries, but recently there has been a bit of, when America pulled out of the Paris Agreement from last year, it did cause a few back and forth, because there's always been an issue with the Paris Agreement, and people saying that, or researchers and experts saying that it's considered soft law, which generally just means that it's weak in its enforcement and is relying majorly on the countries to actually do something or to take action, rather than enforcing strict laws or strict procedures on the countries that are bound by that Paris Agreement. And then if we look at it that way, then we say that it's the responsibilities of the countries themselves to come up with more stringent laws or more coherent laws to regulate the activities within their own, country or within their nation. And then we talk about creating, a coherent legal framework, and then also creating a regulatory framework to ensure enforcement of some of these things. And then we also discuss, things like investing in cleaner technologies as well, and then providing incentives. So in that way, it's able to balance in some ways that people. It balances when we talk about energy equity now, it balances energy justice in terms that if you probably mandate a corporation or give them you provide some sort of incentive to them that to shift from the regular fossil fuels into cleaner technology, and they begin to invest more into that cleaner technology. In that way, they're able to also provide more jobs or to retrain their staff in some way that the staff don't also lose their own source of income as well. And in that way, those are some sort of ways that you're able to, by offering incentive, is a way of balancing some of the issues that we've mentioned when we discussed the energy quadrilemma, but more on what the practical role of law would play in this will be discussed by my colleague Tayo. Thank you.